Welcome, Judd. Can you talk a little bit about the demographics of the KPNX audience?
Sure. We're one of the most rapidly growing markets in the country. And you are, so it's the Valley of the Sun, which is the Phoenix metropolitan area. But the KPNX audience actually goes almost all the way down to the US Mexico border, almost all the way out to California, all the way out to New Mexico, and almost all the way up to Utah. So it's a majority white but rapidly evolving market to where 30% of the households in the Phoenix market specifically have a Spanish speaker in them. So we look like an evolutionary Sunbelt market um, with all of the pluses and minuses that come with that. We have inflationary household growth or housing price growth that doesn't really match wage inflation, for example.
So, how much before the George Floyd protests started last year, how much had you been covering racial justice issues in your newsroom?
So I think that we covered it fairly regularly, but it was episodic. So Phoenix is not different really than any other large place where there would be police stops, there would be that went awry, there would be racial overtones to a lot of to some of the incidents and some to the relations between the community and the police, um, and we would cover those in a very here's the news of the day way. Maybe the news 2 or 3 days later, maybe the body cam video comes out a month later, and so we would cover it as a series of episodes that were strung together, but not in a really contextual way.
And so I'm curious, once the protests started picking up steam last year, what kind of conversations were going on in your newsroom about the protests and about how you guys should be responding to it?
So all news is local, and we were unique in that we had a somewhat similar situation where an African American man named Dion Johnson um, had fallen asleep in his car on the gore point of one of our freeways, and a state trooper went over there, and in a matter of less than a minute, had shot Dion Johnson. And this came right around the same time that George Floyd was happening. And so we covered Deion Johnson episodically, but then it becomes impossible to separate what happened there to what happened with George Floyd. So the conversations start out with how do we cover this story today? And then it's you lift your head up and you're like, oh my God, it's happening all over the country. How do and they inform each other, right? So what's happening in Minneapolis is informing the protests here, and what's happening here is being informed in Minneapolis. And so how do we cover this contextually? Is there a greater statement? Phoenix had a couple nights of protests where they were very confrontational, and again we covered those episodically. We had one night in particular which turned into looting out in Scottsdale. Again, it was covered as looting in Scottsdale, um, maybe with the catalyst of of this, but not really in a large social way.
And where did the idea of deciding to pull all this together into a documentary come from? Who came up with that idea? How committed were you to doing that from the beginning?
So, like all good ideas in newsrooms, this one came from a meeting. Uh, um, there was a meeting of the operating committee, and we were meeting every day. So these are the department heads and senior leaders, and talking about how should we do this? How do we approach what is obviously a critical moment in this community? And we talked about, okay, so let's Juneteenth is coming up. Let's take over our programming for Juneteenth and have some very specialized programming. And so I said, well, maybe let's look at the history of this. And I started thinking about it, and I was like, okay, well, here's these different events that have happened, and as I think about them, they are they're very parallel to what's happening today. And I mean, I distinctly remember being in this meeting and just sort of typing out, you know, let's start here with the influence of the Klan in the power structure, and then go to this 1942 soldiers riot, and then we can go to the sit-ins, and then there's the projects burning, and then there's the MLK ceremony, or the MLK Day controversy. And
controversies.
the basic structure started was done by the end of that meeting. Then we had meetings within the station from all departments with primarily our African American employees, and saying, what should we be thinking about? What are the issues that we're covering? And we use that to sort of inform and guide beyond the historic structure. So there's a section in the documentary where one of our interviewees is talking about the talk, and that specific question, tell me about the talk that prompted that, came from this meeting of employees. So it was really a group effort, and the station was really committed to it. Our marketing department, which has some very, very talented videographers and editors, did the videography and did the editing, and a lot of the rights management, and the newsroom and digital were going out finding people, doing the interviews. In fact, our HR business partner, who's African American and very involved in the African American community, is the one who suggested probably 2/3 of the interviews that got into the movie. So it really was a whole station effort.
Yeah, and I thought that the historic part of it was so interesting because I'm sure that not a lot of people knew about the background of the African American community in Phoenix. Were there things that came out in the course of doing the documentary that either surprised you or any of your staff, or that people made realizations that maybe they hadn't had before?
Yeah. Um, Phoenix is the place that builds over its history constantly. Phoenix was founded on a series of ancient native canals that former Confederates turned into irrigation canals. And the city constantly reinvents itself and regenerates itself. And so I think everyone has forgotten, or many people have forgotten, all of these these events. This is a place with a very transient population base. I think the statistic is 3 people come in, 2 people leave every day, and there's so everything becomes surprising. And so when you start talking about the influence of the Klan and the power structure, yeah, a lot of people say, I had no idea. And then when we got to the 1942 soldier riots at Papago Park, where MPs are machine gunning houses, that is probably the single most commented upon historical thing that we found. Is that
Wow.
here's this thing? What do you mean they went into neighborhoods and did this? So I think I think you expect sit-ins, like if you have a rudimentary knowledge of history, like you expect sit-ins to happen in a city like Phoenix. You expect that some of the project fires of the late 1960s that happened here, would have happened here. If the Martin Luther King thing becomes a defining moment for Arizona for a decade and a half. So you sort of are aware of that if you've lived here. But the further you go back, at one point, the Ku Klux Klan had the county attorney and the county sheriff were both Klan members. But that's the 1920s, and no one here remembers the 1920s because we built over it, and the city has regenerated over that period.
So, what just a couple more questions. What kind of reaction did you get from the community? Did you get any pushback, or was it very positive?
We got your predictable racist pushback from a couple people. Why are you doing this? When are you going to do, White History of Phoenix? But for the most part, I'd say 98% was really positive. And the comments, some ranged from what wonderful people you have who represented, this community so well, and to I didn't know that. And then in several cases, as the person who scripted it, the most gratifying cases really were, you know, to see the parallels between what happened then and what happens now were really what were powerful.
And just one last question. From your perspective in a television news situation, what do you see as the news media's responsibility to cover these racial justice issues?
Well, I think that it's our responsibility to be good stewards of the community. And I think as being a good steward of the community doesn't always mean being the Chamber of Commerce for the community. It means pointing out where there needs to be change or pointing out where change can happen, probably. It's a better way to say it. I think the news media serves as the proxy for the public in a lot of ways. And, we own a printing press. So, and we own a loud bullhorn. And sometimes the responsibility of the people who own the printing press and have the loudest bullhorn is to say, hey, take a look at this. Here's the situation. Now, who's going to change it? And we challenge you to change it.
Well, thank you so much for joining
It's
us.
my pleasure.